June 28, 1919. The Grand Hall of Mirrors at Versailles echoed with the footsteps of weary diplomats. The First World War, a conflict that had devoured millions and reshaped the face of Europe, was officially over. Yet, amidst the celebrations, one man stood silently, a shadow of concern darkening his face. Marshal Ferdinand Foch, the French military commander who had led the Allies to victory, gazed upon the freshly signed Treaty of Versailles with deep apprehension. "This is not peace," he whispered, almost to himself. "It is an armistice for 20 years." Foch's warning was not just a prediction, it was a foresight rooted in his understanding of human ambition, national resentment, and the fragile structure of international agreements. Europe had been reshaped not for stability, but for punishment. The victors imposed reparations, stripped Germany of territory, and curtailed its military capacity. Yet, in doing so, they sowed the seeds of resentment, economic collapse, and political extremism. Little did the world know that exactly 20 years later, a conflict of unimaginable scale would erupt. The Second World War would engulf Europe, extend across continents, and draw the entire globe into a cycle of destruction that would redefine humanity's understanding of war, power, and diplomacy. This is the story of how those who saw it coming tried to warn the world, and yet, despite their insights, history repeated itself in ways both predicted and unforeseen. As the ink dried on the Treaty of Versailles, a few voices spoke words that would echo through the decades. They were visionaries, analysts, and political leaders who looked beyond the immediate celebrations and understood the dangerous trajectory Europe had taken. Their warnings were clear, precise, and prescient, yet largely ignored by the broader world. Marshal Ferdinand Foch, whose military strategies had defeated the German advance on the Western Front, had already foreseen the fragility of this so-called peace. His 20-year armistice prediction was rooted in a deep understanding of Germany's culture, military tradition, and national pride. He recognized that humiliation, imposed economic burdens, and political disenfranchisement could never permanently suppress a nation of Germany's size and ambition. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, the economist John Maynard Keynes was raising alarms of a different sort. In his seminal work, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, published in 1919, Keynes argued that the reparations imposed on Germany were not only punitive but economically unsustainable. He wrote, "The Treaty of Versailles is a humiliation and a punishment that will breed resentment, unrest, and instability." Keynes meticulously calculated the impact. Hyperinflation, unemployment, and social upheaval would become inevitable if these terms remained. His warnings extended beyond economics. He foresaw a political backlash that could radicalize the German populace, creating fertile ground for extremist ideologies. At the same time, Winston Churchill, still recovering from the political turbulence of post-war Britain, expressed concerns in parliamentary speeches. He warned that Germany's reduction in military capacity was temporary. The spirit and intellect of the German military could, and eventually would, rebuild with astonishing speed. Churchill emphasized that Europe could not afford complacency, arguing that a nation humiliated in peace is a nation armed in anger. His words were prophetic, foretelling Germany's rearmament under clandestine programs and covert alliances that would remain undetected for years. Less celebrated but equally important, the political commentator and historian Johannes Steele, writing in various European newspapers between 1919 and 1922, highlighted the emergence of nationalist movements in Italy and Eastern Europe. Steele meticulously charted the rise of paramilitary groups, economic inequality, and social unrest, noting that the current treaties offered no mechanism to prevent their militarization. He observed that the League of Nations, while ambitious, lacked enforcement power and would fail to act decisively when conflicts emerged. Together, these figures formed a chorus of foresight. Foch predicted the timeline, Keynes calculated the economic inevitability, Churchill emphasized military and political resurgence, Steele warned of social upheaval and the weaknesses of international institutions. Across Europe, their warnings converged on one unavoidable conclusion. Unless corrective action was taken, the world was hurtling toward another catastrophic conflict. Yet, the broader international community remained largely indifferent. Politicians celebrated the fragile peace. Populations weary of war and eager for normalcy ignored these warnings. The seeds of the Second World War were sown not in the dark, but in the daylight of treaties, speeches, and publications that the world chose not to heed.
The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was meant to secure lasting peace, yet instead of reconciliation, it imposed harsh penalties that would reverberate across Europe for decades. Germany, once a formidable European power, found itself stripped of territory, its military limited, and its economy burdened with reparations so severe they were almost impossible to meet. The territorial losses were staggering. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France. The Saar Basin was placed under League of Nations administration. Poland regained the so-called Polish Corridor, slicing through German land, while the city of Danzig became a free city under international oversight. Germany lost all overseas colonies in Africa and the Pacific, reducing its global influence. These changes were not mere lines on a map. They represented humiliation, economic devastation, and a psychological wound that would fester for years. The economic reparations demanded of Germany were equally devastating. By the end of the 1920s, Germany faced annual payments exceeding billions of gold marks. Factories closed, unemployment soared, and the German mark collapsed into hyperinflation. Ordinary citizens, who had survived the horrors of the Great War, now faced hunger and social despair. John Maynard Keynes had warned that these reparations would destabilize Germany, and his predictions were unfolding with relentless accuracy. Beyond the economic consequences, the social and political aftermath created a fertile ground for radical ideologies. Discontented veterans, marginalized workers, and a humiliated population were vulnerable to extremist movements promising restoration and revenge. Italy, emboldened by territorial gains that fell short of its expectations, witnessed the rise of Mussolini and the fascists. Meanwhile, Germany's political landscape became increasingly polarized as the Weimar Republic struggled to maintain legitimacy. The Allied powers, victorious yet cautious, formed new diplomatic structures in hopes of preventing another conflict. The League of Nations was established, designed to mediate disputes and enforce collective security. Yet it had significant flaws. The United States, one of the strongest potential members, refused to join. Its lack of military enforcement capability rendered it largely symbolic. The League's failures in addressing Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, Japan's incursions into China, and Germany's clandestine rearmament demonstrated that vision alone could not prevent the march toward war. The human toll of this period cannot be overstated. Millions of Germans faced poverty and despair. Social unrest became a daily reality. Extremist parties gained traction not through ideology alone, but because they promised solutions to suffering inflicted by treaties perceived as unjust. The combination of political humiliation, economic hardship, and international inaction set the stage for a conflict of unprecedented scale. In short, the Treaty of Versailles, intended to create peace,
became the blueprint for future war. Europe had survived one catastrophic conflict, yet it now teetered on the edge of another. The international community had knowledge, evidence, and foresight, but inaction, misjudgment, and the fragility of institutions ensured that history would repeat itself.
In the aftermath of the First World War, the world sought a new order, an international institution capable of preventing another catastrophic conflict. Thus, in 1920, the League of Nations was born, headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. Its mission was ambitious: to maintain global peace, mediate disputes, and enforce collective security. The League's structure was carefully designed, yet inherently flawed. At its core was the Council, composed of permanent members, including Britain, France, Italy, and Japan, alongside non-permanent rotating members. The Assembly included all member nations with the right to debate and vote on issues of war, peace, and sanctions. A permanent secretariat managed administrative functions, while specialized agencies addressed disarmament, refugees, and health crises. Despite these mechanisms, the League faced immediate limitations. Most notably, the United States, despite President Woodrow Wilson's pivotal role in conceptualizing the League, refused to ratify membership due to domestic political resistance. Without the military and economic weight of the United States, the League's enforcement power was severely diminished. Sanctions could be declared, resolutions passed, but no nation had a clear obligation to intervene militarily. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the League's weaknesses became increasingly apparent. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, occupying the resource-rich region despite League condemnation. The League issued reports, called for withdrawals, and imposed symbolic sanctions, but Japan faced no serious consequences. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia, flouting international norms and testing the League's credibility. Again, only economic sanctions were attempted, insufficient to deter Mussolini. Meanwhile, Germany quietly rebuilt its military in violation of Versailles and reasserted its territorial ambitions. The League's failures were not merely procedural, they were also psychological. Member nations, weary from war and preoccupied with domestic instability, often prioritized self-interest over collective security. The lack of trust and coordination among powers undermined decisive action. Foch, Keynes, and Churchill had all warned that Europe's fragile institutions could not withstand political extremism and aggressive nationalism, yet the world remained largely inert. In hindsight, the League of Nations was a noble experiment that collapsed under the weight of reality. It demonstrated the limitations of diplomacy without enforcement, the necessity of economic and military power for international institutions, and the consequences of ignoring early warnings. Its failures directly contributed to the environment in which the Second World War could emerge. The lesson is stark. Foresight alone is insufficient without decisive action, and well-intentioned institutions cannot substitute for political will and preparation.
The period between the First and Second World Wars, from 1919 to 1939, was not a time of true peace. Rather, it was a strategic pause, a fragile interlude during which nations rebuilt, recalculated, and repositioned themselves for the next global confrontation. In Europe, the victors of the First World War sought stability, but their methods often ignored the realities on the ground. Germany, constrained by the Treaty of Versailles, appeared weakened, yet beneath the surface, clandestine rearmament programs were already underway. Factories secretly manufactured weapons, officers trained in military tactics, and nationalistic fervor simmered among the population. Meanwhile, Italy, dissatisfied with the territorial gains promised at the Paris Peace Conference, embraced Mussolini's fascist vision. Aggressive rhetoric and paramilitary activity became routine, signaling Italy's intent to assert dominance in the Mediterranean and Africa. Across Asia, Japan was expanding its imperial ambitions, seeking raw materials and strategic footholds in China, Korea, and Manchuria. These moves were methodical, planned, and often executed without immediate repercussions from other powers. Yet amidst this global repositioning, a striking omission in the international balance of power was the world's largest Muslim population. Spread across North Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, these communities comprised roughly 12 to 15% of the global population in 1920, yet their political voice and influence on global decision-making were virtually non-existent. British and French colonial administrations controlled much of this territory, enforcing policies that prioritized European interests over indigenous populations. The majority of these people had no representation in the negotiations that would determine their futures, leaving them invisible in the calculus of power. Similarly, the Indian subcontinent, home to over 300 million people under British colonial rule, was politically marginalized. While the Indian population contributed massively to the First World War, sending soldiers and resources to Europe, their voices were excluded from post-war settlements. The British Empire, focused on maintaining control and imperial advantage, largely ignored nationalist movements, even as they simmered under the surface. This massive demographic absence in global decision-making contributed to a world where geopolitical calculations were made without considering the majority of its population. The United States, meanwhile, observed these developments with caution. Industrially and militarily strong, America initially refrained from deep involvement in European conflicts, focusing instead on domestic recovery and economic expansion. Yet, behind the scenes, military strategists and policymakers prepared for potential escalation. Japan's growing threat in the Pacific, Germany's rearmament, and Italy's aggression were all carefully monitored, allowing the U.S. to plan multiple response scenarios even before the outbreak of hostilities. During this interwar period, Europe itself remained the central axis of global politics. Trade, diplomacy, and military intelligence were overwhelmingly Eurocentric. Strategic decisions in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East were often extensions of European priorities, not local needs. Consequently, the stage for a Second World War was being set in a manner that largely ignored the majority of the world's population. In short, the strategic pause between the wars was deceptive. Superficial calm masked aggressive preparation, hidden threats, and massive populations excluded from decision-making. Germany, Italy, and Japan were quietly strengthening. The United States was preparing, anticipating future moves, and millions of people, Muslims, Indians, and colonized populations, remained largely invisible in the calculations that would determine the fate of the 20th century.
As the 1930s progressed, the world's powers were quietly aligning themselves for the coming storm. Germany, under Adolf Hitler, sought to overturn the Treaty of Versailles and restore national pride. The Nazi regime, consolidating power through propaganda, political purges, and paramilitary force, began an unprecedented campaign of rearmament. By the mid-1930s, Germany's military expansion included tanks, aircraft, and a reorganized army far beyond the limits Versailles had imposed. Hitler's motivations were clear: Lebensraum, or living space for a growing German population, and the reclamation of territory lost after World War I. Italy, emboldened by fascist ideology, pursued expansion in Africa.
Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, though condemned internationally, demonstrated the willingness of Axis powers to defy global norms with minimal consequences. Japan, meanwhile, was executing a meticulously planned strategy across Asia. Its occupation of Manchuria in 1931 and subsequent establishment of the puppet state of Manchukuo revealed a calculated pursuit of resources, industrial capacity, and regional dominance. On the opposite side, the Allied powers, primarily Britain, France, and later the United States and the Soviet Union, were forced to navigate a delicate balance. Britain and France, still recovering from the devastation of the First World War, adopted policies of appeasement, hoping that concessions might prevent a new global conflict. This strategy, however, underestimated the ideological extremism and strategic intent of the Axis powers. Churchill, who had long warned against complacency, criticized appeasement as a dangerous gamble with Europe's future. Alliances during this period were formed with both ideology and pragmatism in mind. Germany signed the Rome-Berlin Axis with Italy in 1936, formalizing the bond between two expansionist regimes. Japan later joined this alliance, forming the Tripartite Pact of 1940. On the Allied side, treaties and agreements were shaped by mutual defense and shared strategic interests. Britain and France sought to deter aggression through diplomacy and limited military mobilization, while the United States, initially isolationist, began building its industrial and military capacity in anticipation of eventual involvement. These alignments were not solely about territorial ambition, they reflected broader ideological, economic, and historical motivations. The Axis powers were unified by aggressive nationalism, militarism, and expansionist goals. The Allied powers, by contrast, were connected through shared history, economic interdependence, and the recognition of the threat posed by Axis ambitions. Geography also played a role. Europe remained the focal point, while the Pacific and North Africa became secondary theaters that would later expand into full-scale global conflict. Yet even within these alliances, tensions existed. Competing interests, unresolved grievances from World War I, and differing visions of post-war order created friction. The strategic calculus of each nation reflected both foresight and fear as leaders weighed economic capacities, military potential, and the political will of their populations. By 1939, these complex alliances had solidified. The world was no longer a collection of independent nations, but a chessboard dominated by two competing blocs. Each move, each negotiation, and each military preparation would determine not only the fate of Europe, but of the entire globe. The rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime in Germany was not spontaneous. It was the result of a complex interplay of social unrest, economic collapse, and the deliberate use of propaganda. Hitler and his associates understood that controlling public perception was as crucial as controlling armies. Posters, newspapers, films, and rallies were meticulously orchestrated to instill nationalism, anti-Semitic narratives, and unquestioning loyalty to the Führer. Propaganda emphasized the humiliation of Germany after Versailles, portraying the Weimar Republic as weak and ineffective. Hitler's speeches were broadcast to millions using emotional rhetoric to exploit fear, anger, and economic frustration. The Nazi Party portrayed itself as the only force capable of restoring Germany's honor, promising jobs, stability, and national pride. Financial backing played a critical role in enabling this rise. Industrialists, bankers, and wealthy investors, motivated by the desire for economic stability, influence, or alignment with nationalist policies, funded campaigns, paramilitary groups, and election efforts. While some myths have exaggerated or distorted the role of Jewish financiers, historical research confirms that German industrialists, along with sympathetic elites, were instrumental in funding Nazi propaganda and political organization. It is essential to differentiate between anti-Semitic conspiracy myths and verified historical funding sources to maintain factual accuracy. Simultaneously, the economic devastation and hyperinflation of the 1920s left Germany vulnerable to extremist ideologies. Millions of ordinary citizens facing unemployment and hunger were receptive to simple solutions and scapegoating narratives. The Nazi regime capitalized on this vulnerability, merging political ambition with mass communication strategies. Across Europe, similar patterns emerged. Italy's fascists and Japan's militarists also utilized propaganda to unify populations behind expansionist goals. Education systems, media, and public ceremonies were co-opted to reinforce loyalty to the state and its objectives. In essence, the 1930s became an era in which information was weaponized as aggressively as tanks or airplanes. At the same time, international institutions such as the League of Nations watched these developments with limited intervention. Economic sanctions, diplomatic condemnations, and moral appeals were largely ineffective against ideologically driven regimes with clear expansionist goals. The combination of social vulnerability, financial facilitation, and systematic propaganda ensured that extremist movements gained momentum, preparing the world for a conflict that many had predicted but few had effectively prevented. The rise of extremism during this period underscores a fundamental lesson. Economic hardship, political instability, and mass communication can converge to empower destructive ideologies. The warnings of Foch, Keynes, and Churchill and others were not theoretical. They were observable patterns in the very societies they studied. Yet the world's collective inaction allowed extremism to flourish.
While Europe and its allies maneuvered, planned, and predicted the next conflict, a striking truth was overlooked. The majority of the world's population had no representation in the decisions shaping the 20th century. Muslims spread across North Africa, the Middle East, South and Southeast Asia made up roughly 12 to 15% of the global population during the interwar years, yet their political voice was largely absent as colonial powers, primarily Britain and France, controlled their territories. Decisions about borders, trade, and military strategy were made in distant capitals, with little regard for the communities who lived there. Similarly, the Indian subcontinent, home to over 300 million people under British colonial rule, contributed significantly to World War I through soldiers, labor, and resources. Yet in the aftermath of the war, Indians had minimal influence over the peace settlements or the shaping of new international policies. Nationalist movements were active, but the British administration was focused on maintaining control and safeguarding European interests. The result was a massive population whose existence was recognized in numbers, but whose influence was negligible. The consequences of this invisibility were profound. Entire regions, North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, remained strategic pawns, exploited for resources, labor, and military recruitment, yet excluded from meaningful participation in international treaties or alliances. Colonial powers negotiated, expanded, and enforced policies without the consent or input of these populations. As a result, Europe-centric geopolitics ignored a significant portion of humanity, setting the stage for long-term grievances and instability.
This global imbalance also influenced military strategies. European powers assumed control of territories with vast populations, yet underestimated the social and political consequences of excluding these people from decision-making. The world was being prepared for war through European calculations, while the majority of humanity remained spectators rather than participants. Historians now recognize that the neglect of these populations, Muslims, Indians, and other colonized peoples, created a structural invisibility in global politics. Their absence did not prevent wars, but it did ensure that conflicts were fought primarily with European-centric objectives, often leaving marginalized communities to bear the consequences without agency. The strategic pause between the world wars, therefore, was not just a European story. It was a global story shaped by both action and omission, by what was done and what was deliberately ignored.
By the late 1930s, Europe and Asia were on a collision course. Germany, emboldened by Hitler's vision, had reoccupied the Rhineland in 1936, annexed Austria in the Anschluss of 1938, and then demanded the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. The Munich Agreement temporarily appeased Hitler, but it was a fleeting pause rather than a solution. Germany's motivations were clear: reclaim lost territory, consolidate power, and establish dominance in Central Europe. The aggressive expansion, supported by military modernization and propaganda, set the stage for inevitable conflict. In the Pacific, Japan pursued a calculated path toward empire. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and subsequent campaigns in China demonstrated a strategic intent to secure natural resources, industrial bases, and strategic ports. Japan's military, disciplined and technologically advanced, operated with careful coordination, ensuring that expansion proceeded even in the face of limited international resistance. The United States, observing from afar, began planning multiple scenarios. Military strategists and policymakers anticipated both Japanese aggression in the Pacific and European escalation, preparing industrial and naval capacity to respond if diplomacy failed. Meanwhile, the Allied powers, Britain, France, and eventually the Soviet Union, scrambled to react. Diplomatic negotiations, economic sanctions, and limited military mobilizations could not counteract the ideological and strategic drive of Germany and Japan. The League of Nations had long been proven ineffective, leaving nations to rely on national military power, intelligence networks, and alliances. The invasion of Poland by Germany on September 1, 1939, triggered the formal declaration of war by Britain and France. This moment confirmed the predictions of Marshal Foch, John Maynard Keynes, and Winston Churchill. Europe's fragile peace had collapsed under the weight of aggressive nationalism, economic instability, and institutional weakness. In the United States, President Franklin D. Roosevelt monitored global developments with concern. Although public sentiment initially favored isolationism, military planners prepared for eventual involvement. The U.S. began expanding its naval fleet, organizing industrial production, and formulating contingency strategies for potential multi-front conflicts. This preparation ensured that when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, America could respond decisively and immediately, shifting the dynamics of the global conflict. By 1939, the world had entered a full-scale war. Germany advanced through Europe with lightning speed. Japan consolidated its Pacific conquests, and the Allied powers scrambled to coordinate defense.
The foresight of analysts, the warnings of leaders, and the structural weaknesses of international institutions had culminated in the most devastating conflict the world had ever seen. With the outbreak of World War II, the conflict rapidly expanded beyond Europe. Germany's blitzkrieg tactics overwhelmed Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. Cities fell within weeks, armies were encircled, and civilian populations were caught in the devastation. The speed and coordination of German advances shocked even the most experienced military observers, confirming earlier predictions that Europe's fragile balance could not withstand aggressive militarism. In the east, Japan's forces pushed through China, capturing key cities such as Nanjing and Shanghai. The occupation was marked by widespread atrocities, including massacres, forced labor, and severe civilian suffering. Japan's objective was not only territorial control, but also securing resources to sustain its industrial and military expansion. The United States and other powers, initially limited to monitoring, began preparing for intervention. Meanwhile, millions of people in North Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, predominantly Muslim and colonial populations, remained largely excluded from global decision-making, yet they were directly impacted by the war. Troops from India fought in Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East under British command. Millions more faced economic disruption, forced labor, and the threat of occupation. Despite their contributions and suffering, these populations remained politically invisible. Their voices were absent from treaties, alliances, and strategic planning, yet their lives were profoundly shaped by the war's outcomes. The Holocaust, orchestrated by Nazi Germany, revealed the terrifying consequences of extremist ideology, propaganda, and unchecked state power. Millions of Jews and other minority groups were systematically exterminated, illustrating the extreme human cost of hatred and political manipulation. While this genocide is well documented, it is essential to understand that the mechanisms enabling such atrocities, propaganda, financial facilitation, political inaction, were already visible during the interwar years. Across the globe, the war disrupted colonial systems. In Africa, European powers diverted resources and conscripted soldiers, exposing the vulnerability of colonial governance. In India, nationalist movements gained momentum as the British relied on Indian resources while promising post-war reforms that often fell short. These dynamics foreshadowed the post-war decolonization movements, highlighting how war reshaped not only nations, but entire populations that had previously been invisible in geopolitical calculations.
World War II was not only a clash of armies, it was a total war demanding unprecedented levels of economic and industrial mobilization. Both Axis and Allied powers recognized that victory depended as much on production, logistics, and resource allocation as on battlefield strategy. In Germany, the Nazi regime implemented a highly centralized war economy. Factories were reorganized to prioritize tanks, aircraft, weapons, and ammunition. Forced labor from occupied territories supplemented the workforce, enabling Germany to sustain rapid military expansion. Simultaneously, military planners integrated industrial output with operational strategy, ensuring that offensives could be supported logistically across multiple fronts. Italy's industrial base, though smaller, was directed toward North African campaigns and Mediterranean operations. Japanese mobilization focused on capturing and controlling resource-rich regions, including rubber, oil, and minerals, which were critical to sustaining long-term military efforts.
Japan's meticulous planning allowed the Imperial Army and Navy to project power across vast distances, despite logistical challenges in the Pacific theater. On the Allied side, Britain, France, and later the United States coordinated massive industrial efforts. Britain, constrained by limited manpower but bolstered by empire resources, focused on aircraft production, naval vessels, and munitions. Canada and Australia contributed to the production and transport of military materials, reflecting a truly global effort. The United States emerged as the industrial backbone of the Allied powers. Even before entering the war, Roosevelt's administration initiated programs to ramp up shipbuilding, aircraft production, and munitions manufacturing. Once the U.S. joined the conflict in December 1941, the scale of mobilization became staggering. Factories that once produced consumer goods were converted to war production. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, and supply chains spanned continents. American industrial output, combined with strategic planning, fundamentally shifted the balance of power. Economic mobilization was not limited to production. Resource allocation, transportation networks, and strategic stockpiling were meticulously planned. Fuel, metals, food, and medical supplies became critical to sustaining both military campaigns and civilian populations. The integration of economic planning with military strategy underscored that modern warfare was a comprehensive system in which industrial and logistical capacity could determine the outcome as decisively as battlefield tactics. This total mobilization also highlighted the global nature of World War II. Colonized populations contributed labor, resources, and troops, often without political recognition or direct benefit. Industrial hubs in North America, Europe, and Asia were linked through supply chains that spanned oceans, reflecting the interconnectedness of the conflict. Victory, therefore, required not only military genius, but also economic foresight, planning discipline, and the ability to harness the full productive capacity of nations.
From the earliest moments after World War I, keen observers and analysts foresaw the possibility of another catastrophic conflict. Leaders such as Marshal Ferdinand Foch, who warned in 1919 that this war is not over, the next one will be worse, were not making idle predictions. Economists like John Maynard Keynes highlighted the economic instability and punitive measures imposed on Germany, cautioning that resentment, hyperinflation, and unemployment could fuel extremism. Political analysts and journalists across Europe also tracked the rise of radical movements, noting the combination of nationalism, militarization, and societal discontent. Winston Churchill, who had long opposed appeasement policies, consistently warned that Germany's rearmament and Hitler's ambitions posed an existential threat to Europe. These predictions were remarkably prescient. Germany's rapid expansion in the late 1930s, Japan's campaigns in Asia, and Italy's aggression in Africa confirmed the assessments made decades earlier. The mechanisms of preparation, secret rearmament, propaganda campaigns, industrial mobilization aligned closely with what analysts had envisioned. Yet, despite clear warnings, international inaction, institutional weakness, and strategic miscalculations allowed the Axis powers to advance unchecked. The League of Nations, envisioned as a platform for conflict prevention, proved ineffective. Economic sanctions and diplomatic protests failed to alter the course of aggression. The predictions had been accurate, but the world's response lagged, illustrating the tragic consequences of ignoring foresight when inconvenient or politically challenging. Interestingly, some populations predicted to be pivotal, such as Muslims in the Middle East,
Indians under British rule and other colonized peoples remained largely absent from decision-making, despite being directly affected by the outcomes. Their exclusion from global strategy highlights a persistent theme. Accurate predictions are insufficient if the structural power to act on them is concentrated elsewhere. The realization of these predictions underscores the interplay between foresight and action. Historical analysts had observed patterns of economic fragility, nationalist extremism, and militarization. Leaders who anticipated these dangers, Churchill, Roosevelt, and others, prepared strategies and mobilized resources. Yet global institutions and delayed responses allowed warnings to become reality. By the outbreak of World War II, the visions articulated by early analysts had been validated. The war's scope, intensity, and consequences reflected the patterns that had been forecast. Germany, Italy, and Japan executed strategies consistent with predictions. Allied powers eventually responded, but the cost was immense. Millions of lives lost, entire populations displaced, and previously invisible communities left to bear the consequences of decisions made without their consent.
World War II was the deadliest conflict in human history, claiming tens of millions of lives and displacing countless others. Civilian and military casualties together exceeded 70 million, leaving scars that would last generations. The war's human cost was not uniform. Some regions and populations bore disproportionate suffering. The Holocaust represents the most horrific example of systemic genocide. Nazi Germany's state-sponsored extermination targeted Jews, Romani people, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and other minorities. Over 6 million Jews were systematically murdered in concentration camps, ghettos, and mass executions. The methodical efficiency of this genocide, coupled with the use of propaganda and bureaucratic coordination, revealed the extreme consequences of ideological extremism combined with state power. Beyond Europe, colonized and marginalized populations also suffered extensively. Millions of Indian soldiers, conscripted under British command, fought in North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Many lost their lives, while countless others endured harsh conditions, minimal supplies, and extreme hardship. In Southeast Asia, Japanese occupation led to forced labor, starvation, and widespread civilian suffering. In Africa, colonial powers requisitioned resources and manpower, leaving local communities to bear the indirect cost of global war efforts. The displacement caused by WWII was equally staggering. Refugees flooded across Europe and Asia, fleeing bombings, occupation, and genocide. Millions of families were uprooted, creating long-term humanitarian crises that persisted well into the post-war years. Muslim populations in North Africa and the Middle East, along with colonial subjects in Asia, experienced economic disruption, conscription, and social instability, despite being largely excluded from decision-making processes that determined the war's course. Even within Europe, civilian populations faced famine, destruction of cities, and widespread suffering. Strategic bombing campaigns, urban combat, and occupation policies inflicted profound physical and psychological trauma. The total human cost of the war was a direct consequence of aggressive expansionism, ideological extremism, and the failure of global institutions to prevent conflict. By examining the human cost of WWII, it becomes clear that war is not merely a sequence of battles or political maneuvers. It is a profound disruption of life, a displacement of populations, and a test of moral and social responsibility.
The invisible populations we discussed in previous scenes, Muslims, Indians, and colonized peoples, were not merely spectators, they were participants in the human tragedy, often without recognition, yet deeply affected by the global conflict. The war's aftermath also highlighted the importance of accountability, justice, and reconstruction. Institutions like the United Nations, established after the war, sought to address these failures, aiming to prevent such widespread human suffering in the future.
The end of World War II marked not only a military victory, but also a profound restructuring of global power. Europe emerged weakened, its empires exhausted and destabilized. The United States and the Soviet Union rose as superpowers, setting the stage for the Cold War. This shift in global authority underscored the decline of traditional European dominance, which had fueled both world wars. Decolonization accelerated in the aftermath of the war. India, having contributed massively to the war effort, intensified its struggle for independence. In 1947, the British Empire, exhausted by war and facing domestic pressure, granted India freedom, highlighting how global conflict catalyzed the end of colonial rule. Across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, colonies began to assert their political agency, challenging centuries of European control. The creation of Israel in 1948 represented another significant post-war development. Following decades of Zionist advocacy, British mandates, and the aftermath of the Holocaust, international recognition of a Jewish state reflected both historical injustices and geopolitical calculations. In 2026, modern historians and policymakers acknowledge the complex factors that led to Israel's formation, including British colonial decisions, international diplomacy, and the urgent need to provide a homeland for Holocaust survivors. While this development was celebrated by some, it also triggered long-standing regional tensions, illustrating the intricate consequences of wartime decisions. The United Nations, established in 1945, sought to prevent future conflicts on the scale of the world wars. Its founding reflected lessons learned. Global coordination, institutional oversight, and recognition of human rights were essential to maintaining peace. Yet the post-war world also revealed persistent inequalities. Marginalized populations, previously invisible in political calculations, were still striving for recognition, autonomy, and participation in shaping global policies. The global redistribution of power had profound economic implications as well. The Marshall Plan rebuilt war-torn Europe, while the United States leveraged industrial and technological capacity to secure long-term influence. The Soviet Union consolidated control over Eastern Europe, creating a distinct bloc and reinforcing ideological divisions. The balance of power, once dominated by European empires, now rested on two superpowers, each with global strategic interests. In retrospect, the post-war order reflected both the fulfillment of predictions and the consequences of inaction. Analysts and leaders who foresaw conflict, advocated for preparedness, and warned against appeasement were vindicated. The war's outcomes, human loss, geopolitical shifts, decolonization, and institutional reform, confirmed that foresight without action invites catastrophe. The post-war period also provided lessons in inclusion. The recognition of previously invisible populations, the establishment of international human rights frameworks, and the rise of decolonization movements all reflected an understanding that global stability depends on acknowledging the political, social, and economic agency of all peoples. The world had learned, at tremendous cost, that ignoring the majority
is a strategic and moral failure. As we reflect on the century marked by two global wars, one truth becomes clear. History is a mirror of foresight and action. Predictions made after World War I by military leaders, economists, and political analysts were strikingly accurate. Marshal Foch warned, Churchill foresaw, and Keynes predicted economic destabilization leading to conflict. Yet the world's failure to act decisively turned foresight into tragedy. World War II was not only a conflict of armies, but a failure of diplomacy, institutions, and global inclusivity. Millions suffered because decision-makers prioritized power, appeasement, or ideology over proactive measures. Entire populations, Muslims, Indians, colonized peoples, were rendered invisible in global calculations, yet they bore the consequences of wars not of their making. The post-war restructuring, creation of the United Nations, and the acceleration of decolonization represented humanity's attempt to learn from these failures. Nations realized that peace is not achieved merely by treaties or military victory. It requires inclusive governance, recognition of marginalized populations, and the capacity to act on foresight. The creation of Israel, the rise of superpowers, and the spread of international human rights frameworks highlight the complexity of post-war recovery. These events demonstrate that historical decisions, whether driven by ideology, strategy, or oversight, have long-lasting global consequences. They remind us that predicting conflict is insufficient. Implementation, accountability, and equity are essential. For modern viewers, the lessons are profound. The patterns of extremism, economic instability, and marginalization that led to World War II can resurface if ignored. Global institutions must remain vigilant, populations must be represented, and foresight must translate into action. History teaches that ignoring warnings, neglecting the majority, or underestimating ideological aggression invites catastrophe. Ultimately, the story of World War II is both a warning and a call to responsibility. The world learned, through unimaginable loss, that strategic foresight, moral courage, and global inclusion are not optional, they are essential. By understanding the past, acknowledging invisible populations, and acting decisively on predictions, we can hope to prevent future conflicts from repeating the tragedies of the 20th century. As the world continues to navigate political, economic, and social challenges, the reflections of those who predicted World War II remind us, vigilance, preparation, and justice are the pillars upon which lasting peace must stand.